I just come back to the startling and extraordinary thing that we're embedded in a developmental process that only completes successfully if we wake up to the nature of the process we're embedded in and intentionally go out and make sure it completes successfully. That realization changes everything about being a human being. It answers, the most fundamental and biggest existential question of all: what should we do with our life? How should we live?
John Stewart is an Australian evolutionary theorist and a core member of the Evolution, Complexity and Cognition Research Group at the Free University of Brussels. John Stewart has come up with an incredibly original framework for evolutionary theory. And let me just flag two components of it here. So one, he sees a directionality in evolution. Now, directionality is an idea that's been sort of in and out of favor in the history of the field for decades. In the previous few decades, it's been sort of out of favor, but John Stewart proposes a very original and idiosyncratic view of directionality. So it's not at all teleological or anything else you would expect. Second, he sees evolutionary dynamics as being applicable at different scales. So right down to the level of sort of simple organisms to complex multicellular organisms to complex human societies. And the interesting thing here is that you can use that framework then to make sort of judgments about how complex human society functions and where it might be going or where it ought to go. Now, I admit that this one is a lot less structured than these interviews usually are. Not to say that this channel is known for structure, but when you're dealing with complexity as a subject, this is kind of par for the course. So if you stick through sort of the zigzag here, I think a lot is learned. This is my conversation with John Stewart. So I think a good place to start would be to outline the evolutionary worldview that you've been developing.
The very short version is that that evolution heads in a particular direction. Evolution's heading somewhere. It's not some random process that's has no relevance to humanity. So it's headed somewhere, but perhaps the most surprising and significant thing about a proper understanding of the big scale evolutionary processes that have shaped life on Earth and that will shape humanity in the future, the most surprising and extraordinary thing is that there's a role for humanity, individually and collectively, in driving the process forward from here. So that's the way in which, the big claim I make is that an adequate evolutionary worldview can provide meaning and purpose for human existence individually and collectively. And the way it does that is that there is a role for humanity. The process will only succeed on this planet if sufficient human beings wake up to the nature of the process that we're embedded in and use that understanding to guide our future evolution.
Right. So just before we go into that, when you say evolution is heading somewhere, I know you don't mean it teleologically. There isn't some preordained fate for evolution, but you also don't mean it in the sense where people usually mean it, where they just say it's getting more complex and there's just greater orchestration. So where between that?
I hate the notion that it's adequate to say that evolution is getting more complex. Right. That's almost as vacuous as saying that everything is connected. Yeah. Because the key thing about and everything in some senses is connected, but the key issue is, if you want to understand reality, is how is it connected? Because the way it's connected makes an enormous difference. So similarly, the notion that evolution is headed in the direction of increasing complexity, doesn't tell us much at all. It's almost empty. The critical issue is, how does it become more complex? In what ways is it becoming more complex? And it's only when you understand that, it's only when you when evolutionary theory becomes adequate enough to identify the nature of the increase in complexity and what it entails, it's only when evolutionary theory becomes that sophisticated that it can become meaningful for human beings. So just to give an example, if the direction is towards increasing complexity, then what sort of injunctions can human beings derive from that? That we should go forth. We should go forth and make greater complexity. What does that tell us? Almost nothing. But it's a common intuition. So broadly speaking, and this is broadly speaking, over the last 70 years, directionality in evolution has been out of favour in evolution science. Luminaries like Stephen Jay Gould have mounted substantial arguments that there's no direction to evolution. Although towards the end of the book he says, well, there is direction in human evolution, which is interesting that he does that. But so the notion that evolution has a direction has been on the nose. However, many evolutionary scientists believe in this vague notion that things are becoming more complex. And Stephen Jay Gould said, well, that's a passive trend, not a causally driven trend, because if you start off with minimal complexity, if you start off with single cells, then the only way they can evolve is by getting more complex. So if you start off at the left, he called it the left wall, if you graph it, the left wall of complexity, there's only one way to go, and that's to explore possibility space, towards increasing complexity. But coming back to your point, which is a key issue, no, nothing I'm saying depends upon a teleological model, a teleological theory. So I'm not at all suggesting that there is some pull from the future, Teilhard-Descartesian pull from the future, or an inevitability, where the end determines the what leads up to the end. So it's first and foremost, it meets the test of being a theory that is causally driven. So I've gone to great pains to demonstrate that in a number of papers published in international peer-reviewed science journals. I've gone to great pains to demonstrate that to identify the causal micro-foundations that drive this process, forward. So you can then use language like you identify attractors in possibility space that attract this process, but that shouldn't be confused with a teleological perspective. Basically, a teleological perspective, to be, if it were true, it would overthrow the laws of physics and so on, because it would introduce new forces into the universe and so on, and no, this worldview that I'm developing doesn't depend on that.
Yeah. So then, like the idea that things are just getting more complex, is it helpful in the sense that you can roughly estimate certain levels of organization that do have greater complexity than the level below them? I think we're just getting into emergence arguments here, but yeah, that seems like the minimum way to put it, that it's still not vacuous.
There's books being written, there's edited volumes, for example, that address the issue of how you measure complexity.
Right.
And there's metrics and so on. And people who want to be seen to be true scientists, they love developing metrics and so on, and playing in that pond, because it looks like science. If you mathematize things, then it's more serious. But the most interesting things in the world can't be mathematized. I basically agree with probably the guy who will be seen as the greatest evolutionary scientist of the 20th century eventually, a guy called Stanley Salte, who says that if something is sufficiently simple to be able to be mathematized, then it's not complex enough to be interesting. And basically, without going too far off the tangent already, the things that matter most to human beings in this world, in our daily lives and so on, like our political systems and their impacts on individuals and collectives, social systems, psychological phenomena and so on, they haven't been mathematized successfully. The processes of science that have been so successful in dealing with physical systems have failed miserably, when it comes to complex phenomena in social systems and political systems and so on. I mean, there's no model that that gets anywhere near predicting who the next president of the US will be or whatever. None of the touted grand theories of everything go anywhere near dealing with what matters basically in our day-to-day lives. So what science has done, is sit back on the sidelines and point it at the social scientists, which are basically humanities. They're not science orientated. So C.P. Snow, talked about the twin cultures, and he pointed out that there's fundamental differences between humanities investigators and science investigators, and I'd go further without getting into it, but there's psychological differences and so on. But so science sits back and says, you're not scientific. They don't see the great irony that the scientific method, when attempted to be used in the humanities, doesn't succeed. Yeah. It hasn't produced good stuff.
I mean, just to add to that as well, there's pretty good historical record of when, like, a rigorous mathematization of a field is attempted, for example, based dogmatically, not based on actual principles you can find, is disastrous. There's tons of literature on that being done in economics, for example, which is different from sciences that actually work on first principles, because
so I mean, economics is interesting because it's been it's heavily mathematized, but it's also very easily criticizable from a scientific perspective, and arguably it hasn't produced a lot of insights about economics. I mean, the classic example, and this feeds back into this issue of complex phenomenon and the fundamental issue of science's failure to adequately deal with it. I always smile when I read a newspaper article which specifies confidently why the share market increased significantly yesterday, and it'll provide a number of reasons and analysis. It can't apply those reasons to predict what's going to happen to the share market tomorrow. It's only in retrospect. It's like the clever hands, the trained horse phenomenon.
And that's not to say that economics is wrong about everything. Like, the rational actor model is a very solid model, and it makes some really good predictions. But that's just to say that there is this whole space of stuff that should be in the domain of economics that isn't, that the methods aren't up to the task.
That's right, because phenomena is too complex, and I'd like to get into that eventually. So I talk about there are different cognitive levels in human beings. That's what Piaget showed in relation to the development of children, but there's a field post-Piagetian adult development that shows that adults can develop, certainly have the potential to develop and so on, through levels beyond the Piagetian levels. And there's, the popularization of that sort of developmental model is a thing called spiral dynamics, a color-coded system. And I've never met anyone who, it's very easy to criticize, any grand scheme that invents new categories and labels and so on, because it won't be exact, it'll be approximations, particularly when it's dealing with something like human beings. So it's very easy to criticize spiral dynamics, but I've never met anyone who's been introduced to it who hasn't found it extraordinarily useful in understanding different categories of human beings. For example, once you understand spiral dynamics, you immediately know who, the kind of people who will vote for Donald Trump. They're at a certain level of development and so on. So they're actually at the pre-modern level, the modern, which is color-coded blue in spiral dynamics, but the modern level, which gave rise to, current science, mainstream science, is I call that first Enlightenment thinking, or first Enlightenment science. So there is that sort of suggests needs to be a second Enlightenment, and second Enlightenment thinking, will be quite different to first Enlightenment thinking. It'll be, at a higher level of development. So and broadly speaking, without getting into it now, because you've raised some very important questions that I want to get back to. No, it's fun. It's because these things are all interconnected. I mean, that's the fundamental nature of complex systems, that they're all interconnected, and you can't deal with something without pulling threads that, that are connected to other things. Basically, you need a level of cognition that is able to deal with and mentally model and understand complex phenomenon. And the first Enlightenment thinking, reductionist, linear logical thinking, and so on, is only good at understanding those parts of reality that are relatively mechanistic, or can be reasonably approximated by mechanistic models. And complex phenomenon can't be. You can't think through mechanistically complex phenomena in an ecosystem, a social system, political systems, and so on. Because when I use the analogy, the metaphor of mechanism, what a machine fundamentally is, and it's built by this human mind that is at the first Enlightenment level, the mechanistic level. What a machine is something that's decomposable into parts, and you can follow through the interactions of the parts, think it through in a linear way in your mind, cause and effect, and see how the machine operates. Now, walk out into any ecosystem you find, or walk into this discussion about complex phenomenon, or look at social systems, and they're not machine-like. You can't think through the parts. You'll be overwhelmed by complexity, overwhelmed by the number of interacting parts. You won't be able to keep track of them. So you need a higher level of cognition that's been very rare amongst human beings, but needs to spread if we're to understand complex phenomenon, including if we're to understand the evolutionary worldview. So this is the catch-22, that the evolutionary worldview is only understandable by second Enlightenment thinking, what I call metasystemic thinking, because it deals fundamentally with complex phenomenon at all scales interacting together and so on. So coming back to you talked about complexity and the ability, the notion of complexity, and looking at various levels of complexity, levels of organisation, and so on. So I say, well, complexity isn't very useful. It's the form of complexity that matters. What is the form of complexity? And that's what my papers set out to identify. So I'll just as succinctly as I can indicate how this works. So the fundamental notion is this: so you consider an agent-based conception, an agent-based model where you have interacting entities competing together. And those interacting entities may be simple single cells, complex cells, multicellular organisms, human beings, human tribes, human nation states. So this is a very general formulation that indicates a dynamic, a determinative dynamic that's unfolding at every level of entities. So these entities are competing, and in an unstructured population of entities competing with each other, in an evolutionary dynamic, then cooperators don't succeed. Cooperators get selected out. There's a cooperation barrier that, there's various ways of describing it, but there's an impediment to the emergence of cooperation. And this is despite the fact that entities cooperating together always have the potential to outcompete isolated individuals, because entities cooperating together who coordinate their behaviour fundamentally have greater power. So they're more competitive, they have more command over resources, they can achieve things that individuals can't. And you see that in ape societies where eventually, some apes get together and form a coalition. You see it continually in human societies where, coordinated groups outcompete individuals and can achieve things they can never do. And it's because coordination involves and cooperation enables division of labour, specialisation and so on. So each individual doesn't have to be a jack of all trades any longer. It can specialise and coordinate with others to form a whole, that encompasses and integrates the specialisation. So you have this. So cooperation is very difficult to evolve. So this applies at every level, including the human level, which we're most familiar with. It's cooperation is very successful, but there's this cooperation barrier. So just to hone in on this cooperation barrier a bit more, to make it more familiar, cooperation involves using some of your resources to contribute to a group effort or assist others or whatever, to be altruistic. So altruistic behaviour involves using some of your resources that you could have used for your own reproduction and evolutionary success. It's using that to achieve some cooperative outcome, but there's no guarantee you'll capture the benefits of that cooperation. And human beings, we've got terms for all this because this dynamic's fundamental to every living organism, and particularly, ones that form groups like humans. Like we talk about, being treated like a sucker when we, are altruistic but don't get anything in return. Our language is riddled with ways of describing we're smart cooperators to an extent. So but more significantly, the reason why individuals don't capture the benefits of their cooperation is because there are free riders. So this free rider problem happens from single cells, multicellular organisms, human beings, happening now with nation states, possibly leading to the destruction of human civilization. It's the same dynamic, the same evolutionary dynamic that's applied at every level: impeded cooperation, fueled destructive competition. So the free riders love cooperators. For a free rider, there is nothing more joyful in its day than to discover cooperators, to discover altruists, because it takes their benefits and gives nothing in return. So free riders succeed in evolutionary terms. Cooperators, in particularly altruistic cooperators, fail. Cooperation fails. Cooperation does not occur, despite the fact that cooperation potentially, cooperative groups can outcompete individuals. So the question is, how does cooperation evolve? How does it overcome this barrier? And how does it overcome the barrier sufficiently to produce extraordinary cooperatives like our bodies, like who we are, because each of us is a cooperative galaxy of 10 trillion cells. And each of those cells doesn't intend to be cooperative. It doesn't know us. It doesn't know who we are and what we do. Yet, that's right. Yet they're orchestrated by the way our body is organised to cooperate together only by following their own individual interests. So individual cells follow their own interests and in following their own interests, they serve the interests of the whole, which is a human being, and they produce these extraordinary things like talking and walking and falling in love and so on, things that are utterly inconceivable to them. So how has evolution overcome the cooperation barrier, produced these extraordinary cooperative groups? That's the fundamental issue. So games theory is a complete industry. So I talked before about the allure to first Enlightenment science of mathematising stuff. The game theory is produced an industry, because it's mathematised. It creates the illusion of precision, produces rigorous, robust models. However, which basically so largely have produced trivia. Its main function is to demonstrate the difficulty of achieving cooperation. So that's useful, but it's the resources could have been better spent elsewhere, in my view. But so there's no games theory hasn't come up with a general solution, but it has emerged from time to time an understanding, well, probably with Hobbes first of all, with the Leviathan, that human societies, which despite the news focuses us on conflict within human societies, but the reality is human societies are extraordinary cooperatives, where anything on your desk, like a pen, is a result of an extraordinary cooperative enterprise where thousands of people have been involved in mining mining the materials that produce a bit of metal in it and producing alloys and smelting it, and a pen, it's people all over the planet. What an extraordinary cooperative enterprise that is, though it's rarely recognised. So the question is, how do human societies organise that cooperation comprehensively? Hobbes and others basically talk about it's about power. It's about the emergence of governance. And the essence of governance is power or constraint. Most abstractly, in my theories, I talk about the emergence of evolvable constraints. So what constraints do in a human society, and they can be in the form of a king or a government or a chief, a tribal chief. What emergent governance or power does in human societies, it has the capacity to farm the society. You can use various metaphors. Farm the society. It exercises its power to punish free riding. So in other words, ensure that free riding is no longer in the interests of members of the society. They can't come out in front any longer because they get punished. And also, the power can be used to support cooperators. So an entity that was, or a member of society that was previously an altruist, who donated resources for the common good without getting anything in return, the governance structure can allocate resources to the altruist, so the altruist is no longer an altruist. The altruist now can be self-interested. So, and the general formulation of that sort of structure of evolvable governance, which I call management, and I call this management theory, because I've extended it from the human realm, where it's most obvious and analysable and clear because we're embedded in it. I've extended that to all other levels, because this is an all levels dynamic. And it explains the origin of life. So
in biochemistry, the analog is DNA.
Yeah. So, and so when I first had these ideas, I remember the day, the hour, the place. I lived in Canberra, Australia, and I was in my family room, and it hit me that the equivalence between global governance, which needs to occur, otherwise we're finished, because global governance is needed to suppress free riding between nation states and corporations and reward cooperators and so on. You need management. So I saw the equivalence in my mind. It was like an image. It appears the equivalence between global governance of the planet and DNA in a cell. And a cell is, global. It can be, it's evidence which can punish free riding and support cooperation, farm the chemical constituents of a cell to coordinate them together into a coherent whole that can adapt and function as a whole. And that's what needs to happen at the global level. That's the next great step in the evolution of life on Earth, is the hatching of a global entity. And if you stand back from it all and see this process that, first produced cooperation on the scale of a millionth of a metre, the first proto cells, you can't see them, they're so small. They were the first cooperatives, and then there were cooperatives of those cooperatives, and then cooperatives of those cooperatives, and so on. And eventually, where it can only end, other than through destruction, with a global entity. And just as the cell, went through an identification process, and then complex cells, which were cooperatives of simple cells, went through an identification process, and then cooperatives of those complex cells formed organisms that go through an identification process. And this identification process is the fulfilling the cooperative potential to become a coordinated cooperative composite entity that now acts and adapts and evolves as a whole, as an individual. So so if you step back from this process, that's the trajectory of evolution. And it's like a developmental process. It hatches a global entity that then needs to go through an identification process if it is then to participate, in the interactions with other global entities that have emerged elsewhere, and so on. But that's as difficult to imagine for many human beings as it is for cells in our body to imagine, the love life of the body that they contribute to and help orchestrate, and so on. So bringing that back to focus on the mechanism. So cooperation is beneficial, advantageous in evolutionary terms, very difficult, however, to emerge because of the cooperation barrier. But governance, appropriate evolvable governance, can overcome the cooperation barrier by preventing free riding and rewarding cooperation. So what effective governance does is achieve what happens with the cells in our bodies. You don't need altruism any longer. So the individual entities in a properly governed collective simply follow their own interests. So they can be self-interested. They don't have to know anything about the whole they're contributing to or anything else. So it's the old invisible hand in market theory, but it's the extension of it. So but the invisible hand has many flaws because markets aren't properly governed. And part of the reason why they're not properly governed is because the governance isn't constrained to align its interests with the interests of the society as a whole. Democracy is a vain attempt in human societies to try and constrain, the governance of markets. So to have to fully align the interests of individuals with the interests of human societies, you need properly governed markets, and you need the governance itself to be governed in such a way that its interests are aligned with those of the whole. When you achieve that, you have what I've referred to as the self-organising society. So in the self-organising society, if individuals just follow their own interests, then the good will emerge. And how I describe the function of governance achieves this. There's various ways of describing it. I've tried various ways of describing it in order to get the so it's aligning of interests, the interests of entities, but the simplest term is consequence capture. So basically what governance does is reflect back onto the individuals in the collective the consequences of their actions on the collective as a whole. So if an individual within a collective, a cell in your body, for example, does something to harm your body, then the governance will reflect that back onto the individual cell and harm the cell. So it no longer is in its interest to harm the body. Similarly, if something does something beneficial for the collective, then the governance reflects back that benefit onto the individual. So it is in its interest to continue to do that. So a cancer cell in your body is a free rider, and your body has all these mechanisms to make life uncomfortable for cancer cells, for free riders, and it's and it misses. It misses every now and again, and we die. But the reality is, there's potentially cancerous cells emerge in every instant in your body, and they're being kept in check, and so on.
So the key problem is governance. Like these principles of altruism, cooperation, barriers to cooperation, managers that punish free riders, and identification apply at all scales, from the first organisms to eukaryotes to complex human societies. But then something happens when you get to the level of complex human societies where there's too little variation between them, or governance structures just haven't lived up to the task, where the process is sort of halting, in your view?
Well, that's a critically important point, because everything changes when you get near to the emergence of the global superorganism, because the pre-integrated global system will have a small number of entities competing. So there are less than 200 nation states in the world today, unbelievably. But there are major corporations that are as powerful as nation states. So you'd add them in as well. They're competing, and corrupting governments and so on. So that's what you have to take into account. So yes, at lower levels, where you have populations of millions of organisms, the individuals competing with one another, then say you have the emergence of a proto collective, which is the emergence of a manager and the managers always start by exploitation. So a powerful entity emerges, it has the power to rape and pillage, like the British Empire did, rape and pillage the world. set up its colonies in Canada, Australia, rape and pillage the people who previously owned those countries. In any event, Genghis Khan, and the trajectory of the extraordinary emergence of the Mongol empires illustrates this perfectly. So first of all, you get power, and that power will be used in the interests of the entities that are powerful. They'll take what they can for their own interests, and that'll boost their reproduction, so they succeed in evolutionary terms. But the fundamental change occurs when a powerful entity emerges that can farm a group of smaller scale entities over which it has power. And by farming them, and I'm speaking metaphorically there, but by farming them, it can extract an ongoing stream of benefits from that collective, rather than just rape and pillage at once. So Genghis Khan raped and pillaged once, and he actually literally raped and pillaged on all accounts, as you would if you were powerful and you hadn't found a better way. But his sons, like Genghis Khan, Kublai Khan. Kublai Khan farmed China and was a great ruler. So he settled, instead of raping, pillaging, moving on, finding someone else to rape and pillage and so on. And particularly that got hard, to find someone who his father hadn't already raped and pillaged. So he discovered that it was far more effective, far more in his interests, because he could harvest a stream of ongoing benefits, to settle down and govern in China. And on all accounts, he learned how to govern it in a way that maximised the stream of benefits that could be extracted from China. And the way you do that, because there's this enormous untapped potential. So when you start farming clumsily and so on, you can get some benefits. But the extraordinary potential is that if you farm in a way that promotes cooperation between the entities that you're farming, then the entities you're farming become far more productive as a collective. And so I use the farming metaphor because it is very useful here, because you can see human farming techniques that actually follow this trajectory as well, and eventually promote cooperation between, they initially create a monoculture, often, and just maximize the particular thing they're trying to produce, whether it's sheep or corn or whatever it is. But then more sophisticated farming techniques can actually create a collective out of what's been farmed and promote useful interactions between the entities that are being farmed, and thereby maximise the profitability. So that's the trajectory. So and when you're moving into this farming phase, the issue is, well, what's stopping just exploitation? What's stopping the degeneration back into just exploitation and the use of power rather than to use it to promote cooperation? And the answer is competition. So if you've got a population of 1 million managed collectives competing with one another, classic evolutionary arrangement with natural selection applying, then the only way to succeed if you're a manager of collectives is to make your management most effective, to make your managed system most productive. So the evolutionary dynamic that selects out inferior managers that don't promote effective cooperation maximally, the evolutionary dynamic that selects them out, in effect, aligns the interests of managers with the interests of the whole. So that dynamic, basically ruled during the evolution of life on this planet, from these millionth of a metre little cooperatives through the stepwise formation of higher level cooperatives and them forming higher level cooperatives and so on. That dynamic drove the process. That's the causal, I basically outlined the causal micro foundations of this trajectory, and it's got nothing to do with, any teleology, obviously. That's evident from, the description. So that dynamic operated up till the emergence of, probably human tribes, because tribes are small scale, so there are thousands and thousands of tribes of, Australian Aborigines competing with one another, similarly in, in the Americas with the American Indians. So if you look at that whole process, you can say, well, it was driven unconsciously. There was no intention anywhere along the line to produce these outcomes. There was no intentional evolution, no conscious evolution. It was just driven by these dynamics. However, when you get to, when you start getting these very large scale cooperatives forming, so that you don't get many of them competing with one another in the whole world, then you lose that selection between competing societies that keeps the managers honest, that keeps their interests aligned with the interests of the society. Yeah. So I said when we started the discussion that, the extraordinary thing, and it is extraordinary once it, fully sinks into people, light bulbs go on, this extraordinary thing that this process, which is a developmental process that produces the hatching of a global entity, it goes automatically up to a certain point. Then it only completes if it's done intentionally and consciously. So it only completes if the conscious entities that emerge on the planet that are forming these large-scale organisations, if they wake up to the nature of the process, if they wake up to what has to be done to complete the process, which is to cause the emergence of the global entity, and then, most importantly, because that could, you can imagine in a planet that could be stumbled upon, just a global governance could be stumbled upon. We nearly stumbled upon it at the end of the First World War and the Second World War. There was the League of Nations and the United Nations, but both of them were sabotaged, as you would expect, by the dominant powers in the world. Because why would the United States of America subject itself to a higher level of governance that would interfere with its raping and pillaging? So it's, and the history books have been, well, not the history, well, there are histories that people have written that demonstrate, what happened and how it was sabotaged and so on. And, Russia was complicit in that because they didn't want to be constrained. Raping and pillaging, seems like the best option until you see the bigger dynamic, where eventually, if we're to participate, we, as in, if the emergent entity on this planet is to participate effectively in the future evolution of life in the universe, if we're not to be stillborn, then we have to edify, act as a coordinated whole, adapt for the outside future. In other words, so far human societies basically have developed a metabolism, which is the economic system. They've hardly developed so far the capacity to adapt for the outside future, which is the ability of an organism, to interact with other organisms outside it, to have plans, to have future visions and so on. So that happens a little bit during wars, when societies can act for the outside future. So adapting for the outside future is a term used by Stafford Beer, who was a great British cybernetician. And he talked about adaptation to the inside now, which is what goes on in your metabolism inside a cell, inside a society, and adaptation to the outside future. And he looks at how you organise that adaptation, that capacity to adapt to the outside future. So that science of how you build adaptation to the outside future is part of the intentional science that needs to guide, what we do. And when we can adapt to the outside future and adapt as a coherent whole, then the other organisms, that have developed and emerged elsewhere in this universe that is, obviously full of life, then they'll have someone to interact with. So at the moment, imagine you're a global entity that's emerged on another planet. You can adapt to the outside future. You can have coherent plans and so on. And you've been through this bottleneck, where you've nearly destroyed your planet, but global governance has overcome that, and the formation of the entity has overcome that. You wouldn't interfere with what's going on this planet, because these painful processes that could lead to our destruction are equally the processes that have the potential to call into existence a global governance system, and so on. So you need these are the birth pains that impel the emergence of the birth of the global system. So on other planets, they won't. And when we become a global entity, we won't interfere. It'll be like humans trying to talk to and interfere in the development of a chicken egg. We wouldn't have a clue. It's too complex process, and we'd only impede the development. Any clumsy. So to these entities, these that have already reached this level, we're schizophrenic. There's no one to talk to. There isn't an entity on this planet. What would they do? Ring up Donald Trump? No, that's a cheap shot. But I come back to this extraordinary thing, that this process only completes if the sentient organisms that emerge on the planet, that are forming these large-scale collectives, if they wake up to the nature of the evolutionary process that will determine their future, and they use an understanding of that evolutionary process to guide intentionally their own evolution.
Right. So there's these two problems here, or these two perspectives. One is global governance and all the questions around that, and then the other is the intentionality of the individual organisms, the cognitive states, the second enlightenment thinking, meta structures, or what sometimes is called the consciousness building. To focus on that second one, where in, say, cognitive science today, are the schematizations that might be helpful today? Do you think there is some hope?
Yeah, that's the critical issue. So I see myself as an evolutionary activist. So an evolutionary activist is someone who's woken up to the big picture and sees they have a role, in driving that, in actualizing that big picture in a desirable way, and looks at leverage points in the world. What can I do to help drive the emergence of a global organism? And a critical point that you've identified is, well, it depends upon enough people waking up to the big picture, the global, the evolutionary worldview, and for that, it's a highly complex phenomenon. So first Enlightenment science doesn't get anywhere near, understanding this big picture. Because it's not mechanistic, you can't think it through in logical, rational terms and so on. So you need higher level cognition, this cognition that's able to mentally model complex phenomenon. So that's the rate determining step, to go back to my year 12 chemistry. That's what you've got to fix. So that's what that's one of the key tasks of an evolutionary activist, is to do what they can to spread this essential level of higher cognition throughout humanity. So that's been a major focus of mine for, over 20 years. So, for example, what I did in I think it was 2011, was I co-organised what I called the first planning meeting for the Second Enlightenment. And that was held on a yacht in Sausalito, in San Francisco Bay, which is appropriate because all the cultural movements of the last 100 years start in San Francisco. It's an extraordinary incubator of cultural innovation. So who do you invite to something like that? So there's a guy called Otto Lasky who has produced a system for scaffolding, or that can be used for scaffolding what he calls dialectical thinking, but I would call metasystemic cognition. It's this cognition, and there's 28 thought forms, and you can talk to someone or read their books and identify what thought forms are missing, and then train them in the use of those missing thought forms, and so you can scaffold higher cognition that way. So there was him, and then most of the others were people from the integral community. So Ken Wilber, wasn't there, but Sean Hargens was, and Terry Patton, who had Bay Area integral, and so on. Anyway, broadly speaking, and the agenda was to, intentionally work out how to spread metasystemic cognition throughout the world, planning the Second Enlightenment. Basically, the Otto, as I said, had part of the picture. The integral people, despite their background in developing consciousness, really didn't have much cognitively, much to contribute in relation to cognitive development, which is an essential part of it. So basically, it didn't lead to much. And I said to my co-organiser that that the most significant thing about the first planning meeting for the Second Enlightenment is that it was held, that it occurred. Because it's like a symbol of the fact that there are people saying we need to intentionally, scaffold, enhance, escalate the cognition of humanity. In any event, in the last couple of years, I've been looking at, having the second planning meeting for the Second Enlightenment. So I've been searching the world for, tools for scaffolders, for what I call an escalator. An escalator, a developmental escalator, is a set of practices and procedures that will take people from First Enlightenment cognition to Second Enlightenment, from analytical rational cognition to metasystemic cognition. There's lots of ways of describing it. So practically nothing has changed, in the last 12 years. So there's a lady in Portugal who's had some workshops in the complexity science community, which is very positive, because most of the people with broad minds who are willing to, their minds aren't constrained by limited cognition, analytical rational cognition. Those who are willing to, let their minds go where it needs to go to, to see these things in the future. Most of them are, in my experience, the humanities people.
The problem that I think, like, for example, religious practices or spiritual practices or integralism or metamodernism more recently that you've talked about, I think seem like very interesting candidates for tools that that you could put your cognition through to direct it in some direction. But I mean, the problem that I keep thinking about is that they seem kind of politically and economically um, in the dark. Like, they don't seem to have too much of a political impetus in them.
Yeah. Okay. So that's, I mean, you're really putting your finger on a number of critical issues here. So that's the critical issue. I just want to finish off with my world survey of, of people who are working on something that would fit into an escalator, and Ana Milo, the Portuguese academic, she's gone and, she's part of the complexity science community, and she's had workshops that are, associated with conferences now that are explicitly designed to explore not the contents or the products of complexity thinking, but to explore how to create the complexity thinking that produces those products. And nearly all complexity science, is focused on the products. If you read any of the Breathless articles saying, oh, we need to introduce the findings of complexity science into modern management and so on, it's the products. And worse still, as Anna points out, worse still, it's not just the products they focus on, it's the fact that the products are analytical rational reductions of complexity. So she saw that, had these workshops. I was involved in her latest one. Hasn't got very far yet, but she's working on processes that will scaffold this. Very little else that I can find happening. On the issue of what will drive it, so that's a critical issue. That's, will this move from being woo-woo to something that's part of society, part of our economy, that attracts the massive resources and funding needed, and so on. So in essence, because it's useful to go back to the first Enlightenment, because that was, that's, I find very few people appreciate this, but that was a fundamental move in quantum leap in human cognition. So before the European Enlightenment and the first Enlightenment, most people were at the concrete operations stage. They were pre-modern. The religion and the injunctions of religion ruled societies in the main. There were handfuls of people who made it to the analytical rational level, and they stood out like beacons, but not necessarily recognised by the great majority who were at a lower level. But now, in retrospect, they stand out like beacons. So the Greeks, there's a few Greeks and so on. But there was no analytical rational cognition was as rare as hen's teeth. And it was a quantum leap where, for the first time, you could plan ahead without analytical rational cognition. You can't build mental models where you can plan. You can plan very far ahead at all. So you might be able to make tools at the lower level, but you can't build machines, because that involves thinking stuff through. That's the enormous, change that occurred. So what drove it? What drove it was it. So the philosophers, I always get amused when I go to talks by philosophers or whatever, because to them, the whole history of cognition is the history of philosophers, and they'll say, oh, well, Descartes taught us how to think rationally and blah, 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 blah. No, they didn't. No, they often come along afterwards and regularise it and make it and do a metacognitive thing where they see what happened from the outside and can describe it, from an abstract level, which is all very useful and everything else. But no, they didn't drive the actual process. So extraordinarily, what drove the first Enlightenment was mercantilism, which was undermining feudalism. And what mercantilism did was produce societies and a world in which there are enormous financial benefits to be obtained by planning ahead, planning a business, organising a business, which is like building a machine in your head to an extent, and so on. So every increment in cognitive capacity at the analytical rational level was rewarded by the emerging mercantile economic system. And that's what then gave rise to the intentional attempts to institutionalise, the scaffolding of analytical rational cognition, which is our education system. It came into existence with, after the European Enlightenment, and it was to an extent, an intentional attempt to spread analytical rational cognition, first Enlightenment thinking, across humanity. And it hasn't been very effective. And sorry, when I say it hasn't been very effective, I should mention here that this developmental perspective of levels of cognition is offensive to postmodernism and postmodernist sensibilities.
I think a clarification can be made for the postmodernist critique, because knee-jerk, I agree with the postmodernist critique that that there shouldn't be an ethical delineation. There shouldn't be an ethical delineation between people's value in society and how they should be treated. What we're talking about here is more of a matter of development and how education policy should be shaped and how health practices should develop and things like that.
Yeah, a good defence. So and I agree with it. So broadly speaking, these different categories of human beings don't have different values. You need a society that's a composite of them, and that maximally uses their talents to produce, the greater whole. And for that, you need diversity. The evolvability of any cooperative entity, any entity, is closely related to the diversity within it. Its capacity to throw up novel variation and so on. And by the way, that principle applies going upwards as well. So the significance of life on this planet, in a universe where life has emerged, at the global level on many other planets, the significance of life on this planet, because we'll be different. We've had a different history. We've had, the broad parameters and dynamics are the same, but the detail will be different, and that's our contribution. So that's our value to other life forms that have emerged elsewhere, that we are unique. We will be unique, and we have something unique to contribute. And we'll be unique in ways that might be quite different to others, but it's our uniqueness that can contribute to the collective of global entities and the collectives of global entities and so on. So coming back to this difficulty that our education system needs to directly teach analytical rational cognition or formal operations thinking. You need people who see it as object, who can stand outside their own thinking, who are aware of their own thinking and how it operates, and can then see how to scaffold that in other people. So they need to be at least a level ahead, which is people. Hardly any people in the society, let alone school teachers, are that level ahead that can treat it as. And I must mention here that this is, because it's too good an opportunity to miss moving into this point, that my hand waving and saying, you need people at the level above who can see their thinking as an object and so on. That's where the spiritual practices and so on come in. But they need to be adapted in a particular way. They're not the spiritual practices that are handed down in lineages and so those spiritual practices need to be understood through objective models that can then use those objective models, shorn of their baggage, their religious spiritual baggage. Those models can be used to design new technologized, optimized practices that will scaffold this higher cognition. So the key to it, so the reason why the key practices of spiritual transitions have this potential to provide a base for the new technology is that what they train, so what meditation trains is disembedding. So Keegan has the best description of this, Robert Keegan from Harvard, and he didn't develop this very far, but his description is this. He said that development occurs when what was part of the subject at a particular level becomes an object to a new higher level subject at the next level. So to operationalize that into everyday experience, it's moving from from analytical rational cognition to a metacognitive perspective. So a metacognitive perspective is where is a new subject that stands outside the thinking that was part of your subject before. As part of your subject, you were embedded in it. It happened to you. It operated through you. You had that thinking had you. You didn't have it, to use another Keegan term. So the metacognitive level is you can see what your previous cognition was formed of. So that's metacognition, thinking about thinking. What's more powerful is what the spiritual traditions are even better at training, which is that the low-level processes become an object to awareness. So you, in effect, transcend thinking. So you're not thinking about thinking, which is limited because analytical rational thinking about analytical rational thinking, is good. It's better than not having it. But but just awareness, in the witness state, where, to use a spiritual contemplative term, you witness these processes. Now, why is it that witnessing? So why is it that a subject that's not thinking, that's just pure awareness, why is that superior? That's a fundamental issue. And I've written a paper on this, published in the Journal of Consciousness Studies. Why are we an organism that meditates? What is it about our psychological organisation that causes us to benefit from meditation? So, broadly speaking, consciousness is very narrow. So it has very limited bandwidth. And this is one of the few things Western psychology discovered. That's the old Miller, I think, that, you can only remember 6 digits, 4 to 6, whatever. So consciousness is easily loaded. And this is, in our everyday life, we know this, that because if we start thinking deeply about something, the world disappears. If we're embedded in thought, the thought fills our consciousness. Everything else that what we were conscious of before we started engaging in the thought, disappears from consciousness. So this is well established that consciousness is narrow bandwidth. So because it's narrow bandwidth, it's easily loaded, easily filled. The straw of consciousness is easily filled by a train of thought or by emotions. So if we're angry about something, we're not conscious of anything else. We're just angry, consumed. That's the term, consumed by our anger, consumed by emotion, and so on. So what meditation does is, because this is the key point, that a strong emotion or a train of thought contracts awareness down to that thought, that sequence of thinking, or to the emotion. It contracts it down while if consciousness is unloaded, as it is if you're in the present, then you have uncontracted awareness, and you're aware of, you rest in spacious awareness. Awareness is spacious. So you meditate, do you, by the way? Or?
Yes, I do.
Right. Okay. So I've never met anyone who's started meditation who isn't grateful that they did. So yeah, and
I've struck like I've had. I don't think I abide by a strict routine or a strict style of meditation. I've been trying a few, but more or less it's just sitting there and trying to empty your mind.
Yeah. So the essence of meditation is that you try and when you start, you go in a darkened room, minimal distractions, and you sit there, and when you find you're embedded in thinking, you start thinking about what you've got to do next, and blah 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 blah. This isn't working. What the hell? All those thoughts start arising. When you notice you're embedded in thought, you move your attention gently to sensations in the body, or something that doesn't engender further thinking, and so on. And then you find then a few moments later, you find you're embedded in thought again, and you do the same thing. Or you might get embedded in emotion if you're an emotionally orientated person, which I'm not. So you're strengthening the muscle to disembed attention and to put it in an uncontracted state. And the more you do that, the more you quieten the more your mind quietens down, the thinking and emotion quietens down. And, I find when I started meditation, 15 minutes after I do that, there's some transition occurs, and I'm in uncontracted awareness, and it's like, my awareness is solid. It's not thinking, disturbing it. It's not in, so that's, and I don't know how common that is in experience with other people, but that's it. So
I feel that. I think I recognize that in the moment I stop meditating.
right,
Like when you come back,
right.
you contrast that from your earlier state, and then you realize, oh yeah, there was kind of a unity or a emptiness to that earlier state. If you're having particularly good,
Right. Well, then you could go back into it. That's what I would do. But anyway, it was all about self-tinkering, self-experimentation, and so on. It's there's no fundamental formula that works for everybody, and it can't be described anyway. It can't be formularized because it's all based on your internal workings, and only you know what they are and can experience them and play with them. But so to me, the phrase, so I was brought up, going to a Christian school and so on. So, and there's a saying, I think it comes from one of John's Gospels, that talks about experiencing the peace that passes all understanding. And to me, that's the state I go into with meditation. It's the peace. It's an extraordinary, it's always surprising, and it's the peace, and it passes all understanding. You can't understand it. And if you start trying to understand, you think about it, well, it's gone. But in any event, coming back to, so then the key thing is, and this is where most, the majority of meditative practices, they end, when you come out of the meditation. But no, so if you want to use this muscle you're strengthening of witnessing, if you want to use that in the service of higher cognition and higher social emotional development, then you need to be able to access that state in the midst of ordinary life. So the challenge becomes, how do you move from the meditation cushion to experiencing the witness state to which your thoughts and emotions can be object. How can you do that during the day, in meetings, work meetings or whatever, during an argument or whatever? So
Right.
part of the trick is to be able to do it anytime, because you won't understand how controlled you are by your likes and dislikes until you act differently to them. So so that's a trap. It's a trap to only use it to feel good, because then it's in the service of the ego. And when the goal is to be able to stand outside, holus bolus, the ego, and interact with people and be in this witness state while you're interacting with them and so on. And
right. And I think even stronger, like all kinds of dynamics could pop up that could be detrimental if you're only using it for the positives or the
that's right. And including dynamics where you're fooling yourself and so on. So an old technique was an old Gurdjieffian technique. George Gurdjieff, 100 years ago, his key thing was waking in the midst of ordinary life. So he was developmentally orientated and so on. So he developed some practices that haven't really survived till today in their fully blown form, as far as I can tell. So he basically, his practices involved, he said, well, you'll only find out the emotions and so on that control you if you'll only be able to experience them and detach from them if you do the opposite of what you normally do, if you break these rules. So if someone holds out their hand and you don't shake the hand in return, and you observe what happens inside you. And what you need to be able to do is, you'll come up with negative feelings, and you need to be able to watch those negative feelings and not be controlled by them. And then afterwards, after you've done the exercise, you might apologise to the person or whatever. But so breaking, social rules, is part of developing this capacity to stand outside and witness these psychological forces, emotions and thinking thought patterns that currently govern you and control your behaviour and constrain what you do. So just to fit that in, because I talk about, the cognitive capacity is really important, but so too is the capacity to be what I call a self-evolving organism. So and both of them require scaffolding, and both of them require the use of practices from the spiritual and traditional and contemplative traditions that need to be adapted, need to be developed further, and eventually will be in a relationship to the spiritual and contemplative traditions. They'll be technologies that have technological purposes and technological effects and intentional effects, and so on. So they basically, to achieve a particular goal, and in the case of what I'm talking about, it's evolutionary goals. So you're an evolutionary activist, and you want to advance the evolutionary process on Earth, and you need two capacities to do it effectively. First of all, you need the cognition, which we've talked about. You need second enlightenment cognition, metasystemic cognition, because you're dealing with complex phenomena, and to deal with them effectively, you need to be able to model those phenomena and use those models to test out in your head what the most effective strategies are. So metasystemic cognition is needed for evolutionary strategizing, but that's not enough. That's a significant component. The other component you need is the ability to be able to implement those strategies. So it's one thing to see the strategies, it's another to implement them. So to implement them, you'll be sabotaged at every move by your existing emotional system and impulses and so on. The likelihood that what you need to do to serve future evolution, the likelihood that that will be congruent with the predispositions and emotions that were shaped by our past evolution, particularly in our tribal system, the likelihood that they'll be congruent, is infinitesimal. It's like a group of single cells sitting around a table saying, and discussing their evolutionary future. And a particularly smart single cell saying, oh, we need to form collectives. We need to get together and be touching one another all the time, and embedded in our mutual excreta and so on. And the individual free living cells would say, what the hell? We don't want to do that. We're much happier free living. This is a good life we've got here. We don't want to be bound together and constrained and so on. And so at every stage in evolution, organisms have their predispositions, their impulses, their likes and dislikes, so to speak, to use general terms, had to change. And it'll be the same for our future evolution. So we will, so you can come up with a grand strategy of how you individually can advance the evolutionary process, but it might entail you doing things that you aren't motivated to do. From the very simple things like you'd rather sleep in every morning than, which is a big issue. It's not necessarily talked about that often, but for all of us, individuals in this world, we have conflicts between our inbuilt motivations and what we want to do, our longer term goals all the time. So part of being an effective human being in the world, but particularly for achieving evolutionary ends, is the ability to move at right angles to the motivations, emotions, and so on that we inherit from our evolutionary and cultural and social past. So the mind is modified by our upbringing and so on. So again, the fundamental tool is to be able to stand outside these motivations and emotions, observe them as they move through our body, not be bound by them, not have to act on them, but watch them dissipate, and also techniques for then finding motivation in what it is we have to do to advance the evolutionary process. So I have to go through a process, to motivate myself to talk to you this morning, my time, this evening, your time. So, I don't find, it's not what I would do, given my predispositions, genetic, it's not my idea necessarily of fun, but I have to find, I have to, in effect, move at right angles to those impediments and find satisfaction in doing this. And it hasn't been so bad, so again, it's, standing outside.
Right.
So what's needed is what Gurdjieff called work on oneself. So the proper life lived by a human being is to maximise their potential, is continual work on oneself. So it's seeing what he called it the machine, seeing the machine, your body, mind. He called it machine in order to distance it and help the process of making it object. So it's to get to know the machine and be able to manipulate the machine so as to align its goals and so on with these longer term political evolutionary goals or whatever. So he actually developed the term the self-evolving organism. So the self-evolving organism, to be able to evolve, you're going to be able to remake yourself. Every element of the machine, you need to be able to remake it so that you can serve the demands of future evolution, because we've been made by past evolution. So the appropriation of spiritual practices, should be designed to develop technologies that enable us to remake ourselves in these particular ways. And just sitting on the meditation cushion and, following the untechnologized practices, won't achieve that. Often it'll achieve spiritual bypassing, or as I say it, it's much of it constitutes spiritual masturbation. It's using these techniques for the good feelings, and de-linked from their evolutionary purpose. So I can't emphasize more that it's, yes, the spiritual and contemplative traditions are the current repositories of the repositories of the best techniques currently available for helping us to remake ourselves, but they're at a very early stage. Their relationship to what the final technologies will be like will be as distant as is folk psychology from scientific psychology. And that's what you'd expect, because it's folk techniques for remaking ourselves.
Yeah, of course.
So that actually brings me to the sacred. So one of the startling things that really impacted on me was when I read a book by a guy called Roy Rappaport, there was a flowering of systems science and cybernetics, which is basically my intellectual background, my intellectual heritage. The Macy conferences, Norbert and Wiener and Gregory Bateson, amongst them, and Ashby, and Rappaport is one of them as well. So he came out of that and applied it to his to the understanding New Guinea tribes. And New Guinea tribes are fascinating because very mountainous country. So the tribes in one valley were largely isolated from tribes in another valley, and so on. So a wonderful evolutionary laboratory. Margaret Mead, Bateson, many others were attracted to it and studied New Guinea tribes. And the thing that hit me between the eyes that he came up with was that he identified the evolutionary purpose of the sacred. So what he observed and demonstrated was that the beliefs of a tribe that design the tribe and locate it in a particular place and determine its fundamental social relations and so on, that those beliefs are organised in a hierarchy. And at the lowest level, the way you cook your food and everything is at the lowest level of hierarchy and can be adapted. That's in the profane. It can be adapted day to day, week to week, or year to year, or whatever. But at the highest level of the hierarchy, in this default hierarchy, then your most fundamental beliefs are those that tell you who your tribe is, where it needs to live, and so on. It's the one that locates you most fundamentally. Now, so the challenge facing evolution was, well, people can tinker, with the way they cook their food and so on. What's to stop tinkering with these most fundamental principles that they don't understand? They don't have a theory. They're not sociologists, anthropologists, or whatever. They don't have a theory. They think it's gods or spirits or whatever that handed down these principles. But these principles need to be protected. You need to protect them from the tinkering and so on. And hence the category, hence why human beings are an organism that has this thing called the sacred. The sacred, treating things as sacred, is a way of stopping them from being tinkered with by a level of cognition that's incapable of understanding them and therefore rationally, deciding to protect them. So the pertinence of that, apart from the fact that it's a great book and so on, and this default hierarchy, by the way, is what emerged in John Holland's classifier system. John Holland, the great complexity theorist, probably the only really significant one the Santa Fe Institute's produced. And his classifier system self-organised into a hierarchy. And there was nothing in the system that called it the sacred, but the most fundamental rules that were then refined by lower rules in the hierarchy were what need to be protected and need to mutate very slowly and so on. Anyway, I won't go into more detail, but a lot of the people from the humanities side, from the postmodern side, treat spiritual traditions as the sacred. These are sacred traditions and so on, and they like to come from a lineage, so it's almost ubiquitous that they sign up to some lineage, whether it's Buddhism or Taoism or whatever, Advaita Vedanta. They treat the traditions handed down through the lineage as sacred, not to be tinkered with, not to be treated as profane and something you can muck around with and so on. So the archetype, the Jungian archetype, which is evolutionarily implanted, that animates me, I've recognised, and it's a dangerous one, is the rebel archetype. And I hate the sacred. It's in my nature to hate religion, hate the sacred, and so on. I want to attack the sacred. I'm part of the mutation process that rarely arises and rarely survives. Because if you start attacking the sacred, you'll find that traditional tribal societies, aren't all kindness and light and so on. If you break the rules, you are thrown out, you are murdered. So I attack the sacred, and that's what has to be done to the traditions. So their sacred practices need to be technologised, need to be profanised, need to be subject to mental models that are then used to adapt them and change their effects and enhance their effects for what we need now. So arguably these practices were preserved by Noah's Ark and what Noah's Ark was pointing to. And the Noah's Ark metaphor is that every part of this planet has been subject to war and destruction and so on. And any system of ideas that could be used to enhance human effectiveness in the world would have been adopted by, a side in the war, and then that side would eventually lose, as every side eventually did, and these practices would be wiped out. So Noah's Ark is a metaphor for creating little seeds that could exist across time, and that's what monasteries are in the mountains, Tibet and so on, until a time arose when hopefully there wasn't this continual war and destruction, and those processes could then be taken and used for what their evolutionary purpose is, which is to enhance human effectiveness in the world, to enhance our ability to use an understanding of the evolutionary process to guide our social and cultural evolution and so on. So we're at that time where Noah's Ark has succeeded. We've got these practices. They have been treated as sacred. Now it's my time, the rebel archetype, to come along and say, no, we will appropriate your sacred practices. We will change them. We will meddle with them. We will, perpetrate violence on them with the goal of harnessing them in service of our future evolution, of greater effectiveness in the world.
You need to come back to the cave, so to say. You need to mechanize these things eventually. Like an economist listening to this, a particularly generous economist, would say that this is all good. that making the individual better aware of the dynamics of the part, but we still don't have a mechanism that competes with market dynamics.
You've just brought me back to the point that I started answering, 3/4 of an hour ago. Your very good point about how do you say, the evolutionary goal is to spread higher cognition and the capacity to be self-evolving, across millions of humans at least, a critical mass. How can we do that? How can we get the resources and so on? And I went through how it was mercantilism, not philosophers, not religions, mercantilism that incentivised the development of analytical rational cognition. It drove the first Enlightenment. So what I've worked on after the first planning meeting for the second Enlightenment was how can this be packaged? How can this escalator be packaged in such a way that it too, its spread is driven by capitalism, driven by markets and so on. And really, it's spirituality per se, hasn't been driven by markets, but the use of the co-option of these techniques and the refinement of them and the technologising of them so that they increase effectiveness in the world is of enormous value in our current capitalist economy. So, at the upper levels, at the executive levels, at the CEO level of all major corporations, the problems that ideally have to be dealt with effectively by the senior executives are complex problems that are impenetrable largely to analytical rational cognition. So a major international corporation has to deal with interacting systems of government, politics, social systems, its competitors in the market across international borders, as complex as can be. So if you can develop an escalator that moves people to metasystemic cognition, then the market will beat a path to your door. It'll be far more monetizable, than a new, better mousetrap or a better tasting breakfast cereal, which is what gets plenty of funding in our current world. So currently the CEOs of major corporations are in over their heads. They're cognitively incapable of dealing with the complexities. And hence the reason why many of them, if you ever encounter them, wear extremely expensive suits and strut around and are super confident and are psychopathic because they can carry off the pretense. If they're psychopathic, they can carry off the pretense that they know what they're doing. A normal, fully rounded human being, of which I'm not one, but I understand this, a fully rounded human being would fall in a heap. They'd say, look, I can't do this. This is all bullshit. But no, psychopaths, they can carry it off. But if you can actually build an escalator. So anyway, I started down that track and developed a program, which I trialled here in Melbourne, and learned a lot from, which is the reason why you do a trial. But basically, there was two parts of the program. One was to develop the capacity to wake up in the midst of ordinary life. That is, to be present in the witness state in the midst of ordinary activities. So the first half of the program is designed to scaffold that capacity. The second half is then to scaffold the higher cognition. So making use of that witness capacity and ability to be self-evolving, to use that capacity to install the new thought processes that are needed to constitute metasystemic cognition. So what I discovered ultimately from the process was that it has to be done one-on-one. So I trialled it as a group, and as a group, basically, because it's highly individualized, so the same reason why only you can do your own meditation, the scaffolding needed for any given individual will be fairly unique and idiosyncratic, and depends upon where they are. So you need to develop. So if you want to help scaffold a person, and the object is to scaffold them enough for them then to become self-scaffolding, so that they recursively self-improve themselves. So recursive self-improvement is just a fantasy in AI, but it's a reality for human beings now, has been. Recursive self-improvement is what we have to do to develop ourselves and develop ourselves and develop ourselves. So, and the people who think that, no, that's something for AI only, are people at the analytical rational level, you know, like Ray Kurzweil and so on, who have never developed themselves intentionally throughout their life and don't see themselves as object, you know, and don't, I'm sure, would he meditate? Well, he certainly wouldn't use meditation for developmental purposes. So, the recursive, so this program I developed, you know, has to be individualized, because you have to actually interact with a person in such a way that you understand how their mind works, how their current thought processes work, what they're missing in terms of metasystemic cognition, and so on. And you have to design specific, you know, processes and exercises, and you have to move their attention around by your questioning and scaffold this, you know, these new thought processes. And it's an individualized process. And basically, it's not for me. So I'm a rebel archetype, I'm not a people person. To me, it would be hell on earth to spend the rest of my days dealing with individuals and scaffolding them. But I'm trying to find individuals in the world who can do that. And as I said, there's the Portuguese Ana Milo, you know, who's developing a scaffolding process. It's moving nearer to the time where we need a second planning meeting for the second enlightenment. But I just come back to the startling and extraordinary thing that we're embedded in a developmental process that only completes successfully if we wake up to the nature of the process we're embedded in and intentionally go out and make sure it completes successfully. That realization changes everything about being a human being. It answers, you know, the most fundamental and biggest existential question of all: what should we do with our life? How should we live? And it's enhanced if it's done consciously. So you're contributing to the advancement of the evolutionary process on this planet here and now, and you're doing extremely well. The more intentional and conscious it becomes, the better.